A police officer, blinded by prejudice, confronts a black teenager on a quiet suburban street. With an air of arrogance and unchecked authority, he escalates the situation without cause, pushing the teen beyond reason. Then, in a shocking moment of aggression, the officer punches him, convinced he'll face no repercussions. But what he doesn't know is that this teen is far from ordinary. He's the nephew of one of the most powerful figures in law enforcement, the FBI director. What happens next will leave the officer stunned and teach a powerful lesson about respect, accountability, and the dangers of unchecked power. Before we dive into this gripping story, let us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more impactful tales that challenge injustice and inspire change. Stay tuned. This story is one you won't forget. The officer's voice cut through the air, sharp and authoritative. He wasn't the kind of man who questioned his own actions. Years on the force had taught him to act first and think later, a method he justified by calling it control. For him, respect wasn't earned. It was demanded, especially from people he already assumed were in the wrong. His uniform gave him a sense of invincibility, a belief that his authority could go unchallenged. It wasn't the first time he had used his position to target someone, and it wouldn't be the last, or so he thought. Prejudice shaped his actions, a habit that had gone unchecked for years. Every dismissive tone, every unnecessary confrontation, built upon the arrogance he carried with him like armor. Across from him, the teen stood calm and composed. He was polite, yet there was an unmistakable strength in his demeanor. He didn't need to raise his voice to hold his ground. Years of facing assumptions about who he was had taught him how to navigate these moments with resilience. Raised in a family that valued integrity, he had learned to meet injustice with quiet strength. He didn't flaunt the connection to his influential uncle, a high-ranking FBI director. That wasn't his way. His confidence wasn't tied to his uncle's power, but to the values instilled in him: fairness, dignity, and a belief in justice. The officer's tone grew sharper, his irritation evident. He wasn't used to someone standing firm without showing fear. The teen's composure wasn't defiance, it was self-respect. But to the officer, it felt like a challenge. His arrogance flared, and his questions became more aggressive, pushing boundaries under the guise of authority. The teen's responses were measured, never rising to match the officer's tone. He asked questions of his own, each one revealing the shaky foundation of the officer's accusations. Calmly and steadily, he stood his ground, his voice unwavering. But the officer wasn't someone who handled challenges well. His temper simmered beneath the surface, fueled by his belief that power gave him the right to act without consequence. The teen's calm demeanor was a mirror, reflecting the officer's biases back at him. And while the teen never raised his voice, his presence alone felt like resistance to the officer, an unspoken refusal to be diminished. What the officer didn't know, though, was that this encounter wouldn't end like the others. For the first time, his actions were about to face consequences he couldn't ignore. The officer's footsteps quickened as he closed the distance between himself and the teen. His questions were sharp, accusatory, and laced with assumptions. "What do you think you're doing here?" His tone demanded submission, not answers. The teen paused, his expression calm but alert. "Walking home," he replied simply, his voice measured and polite. The officer's eyes narrowed, his demeanor shifting to one of condescension. "Walking home? Around here? You expect me to believe that?" He stepped closer, his body language heavy with intimidation. "I live nearby," the teen responded evenly, not flinching. His calm demeanor seemed to irritate the officer, who was used to people cowering under his authority. "You got ID?" the officer barked, his tone sharper now. The teen nodded and slowly reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. "Here's my ID," he said, handing it over. The officer barely glanced at the card before shoving it back. "Doesn't look like you belong here," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for the teen to hear. The teen stood his ground, his composure unwavering. "Is there a reason you stopped me, officer?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The officer's irritation flared. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "You're loitering, acting suspicious. I've got every right to ask questions." "Loitering?" the teen asked, raising an eyebrow. "I'm just walking home. Is that against the law?" The officer's face flushed with anger. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone who didn't immediately fold under his scrutiny. "Watch your tone," he growled, stepping closer. "I'm just asking a question," the teen replied, his voice steady. "What have I done wrong?" The tension between them thickened, drawing the attention of a few bystanders who paused to watch the exchange. The officer noticed the onlookers, but didn't seem deterred. If anything, their presence seemed to embolden him. "You're resisting," the officer said suddenly, his voice louder now. "I don't like your attitude." The teen frowned slightly, his composure still intact. "I'm not resisting," he said calmly. "I'm answering your questions." The officer's frustration boiled over. He stepped even closer, his hand hovering near his baton. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he spat. "You think you can talk your way out of this?" "I'm just trying to understand why I'm being stopped," the teen said, his voice still level. The officer's face twisted with anger. In a sudden, aggressive move, he reached out and grabbed the teen by the arm. "You want to play games? Let's see how smart you are at the station," he said, his grip tightening. The teen didn't resist, but he didn't shrink away either. "You don't have a reason to take me in," he said, his voice calm but firm. The officer's grip tightened, and in a moment of unchecked aggression, he raised his other hand and struck the teen across the face. The force of the punch caused the teen to stagger slightly, but he quickly regained his balance, his composure unbroken. Gasps rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. A woman pulled out her phone, her hands shaking as she began recording. Others murmured in disbelief, their expressions a mix of shock and disapproval. The teen slowly straightened, his hand brushing his face where the officer's fist had landed. His calm demeanor remained, though a quiet strength now shone through his steady gaze. "You're going to regret that," he said softly, his voice unwavering. The officer froze for a moment, caught off guard by the teen's calm response. "Excuse me?" he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. The teen didn't elaborate. He simply looked at the officer, his composure unshaken, as if he knew something the officer didn't. The tension in the air was palpable. The officer, still bristling with anger, glanced around at the onlookers. He saw the phones pointed in his direction, the expressions of disbelief on the faces of those watching. For a brief moment, doubt flickered in his eyes. But his arrogance quickly returned and he straightened his posture. "You think you can intimidate me," he said, his voice rising. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The teen's expression didn't change. "Neither do you," he replied simply. The officer's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, another officer approached, drawn by the commotion. "What's going on here?" the second officer asked, his eyes darting between the cop and the teen. "Got a smart mouth here who doesn't know how to follow instructions," the first officer said, his tone defensive. The second officer glanced at the teen, then at the crowd. who were now openly recording the scene. His expression shifted, a hint of unease creeping into his demeanor. "We need to de-escalate," he said quietly, placing a hand on the first officer's shoulder. The first officer shrugged him off. "I've got this under control," he snapped. The teen remained silent, his calm gaze fixed on the officer who had struck him. The quiet strength in his demeanor spoke volumes, a stark contrast to the officer's blustering aggression. As the crowd murmured and the tension thickened, the teen finally spoke again. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" The officer scoffed, his arrogance returning. "I don't care who you are," he said, his voice filled with disdain. The teen gave a faint smile, the kind that spoke of certainty rather than amusement. "You will," he said softly, his words carrying a weight that hung in the air long after he had spoken. The officer's confidence faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, barking orders at the second officer to take control of the crowd. The onlookers, however, didn't budge, their phones still trained on the unfolding scene. The teen stood tall, his calm presence unshaken despite the hostility directed at him. His quiet confidence was unyielding, a reminder that power didn't always come from authority. It came from knowing who you were and standing firm in that truth. What the officer didn't know was that his actions were about to bring consequences he had never anticipated. The tables were about to turn, and the power he had wielded so recklessly would soon slip from his grasp. The officer stood tall, his chest puffed out with an air of authority that masked the uncertainty flickering in his eyes. He looked around at the growing crowd and back at the teen, who stood unmoved, his calm gaze locked on the man who had just struck him. "You think you're untouchable?" the officer barked, his voice rising to compensate for the cracks in his confidence. "You can't just walk away from this." The teen wiped his face with the back of his hand, his movements slow and deliberate. His calm demeanor never faltered, though his words carried a weight the officer wasn't prepared for. "You don't know who you're dealing with, but you're about to find out." The officer's laugh was forced, almost hollow. "Oh, really? And who do you think you are?" The teen tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to convey his certainty. "I'm someone who believes in accountability," he said quietly, his voice steady but sharp. "And that's exactly what you're going to face." The officer took a step closer, his voice dropping in volume, but not intensity. "Is that a threat?" he asked, his tone laced with hostility. "No," the teen replied, his calm demeanor like a mirror reflecting the officer's rage. "It's a promise." Reaching into his pocket, the teen pulled out his phone. The officer flinched slightly, his hand instinctively moving toward his baton, but the teen didn't react to the sudden movement. Instead, he calmly tapped his screen and held the phone to his ear. "Who are you calling?" the officer demanded, his voice tinged with unease. The teen didn't answer immediately. He waited for the call to connect, his gaze never leaving the officer's face. When the line picked up, he spoke, his tone calm but firm. "Uncle, it's me. We have a situation here." The officer's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. "Uncle?" he repeated under his breath, his posture shifting slightly as the teen continued speaking. "I need you to send someone down here," the teen said into the phone, his voice steady. "It's not just about me. It's about accountability." The officer's face paled as the realization began to dawn on him. "Wait, what did you just say?" he stammered, his voice losing its edge. The teen ignored him, finishing his call with a simple, "Thanks, Uncle. I'll see you soon." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his movements as calm and deliberate as before. "Who was that?" the officer demanded, though his voice now lacked the authority it carried moments earlier. The teen looked at him, his expression unreadable. "That was the FBI director," he said plainly. "My uncle." The officer froze, his arrogance replaced by a growing panic. "The FBI director?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," the teen said, his tone unwavering. "And he'll want to know why one of his nephews was punched in the face by a cop without cause." The crowd, which had been murmuring quietly, fell silent. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air, and the officer's disbelief was written all over his face. "This is some kind of joke," the officer said, though his words lacked conviction. "You're just trying to scare me." The teen raised an eyebrow. "Do I look like I'm joking?" he asked, his calm demeanor unshaken. The officer's gaze darted to the crowd, then back to the teen. His mind raced, searching for a way to regain control of the situation, but the usual tools of intimidation and authority were slipping from his grasp. You should have just complied," the officer stammered, his tone defensive. "I did comply," the teen replied evenly. "You were the one who escalated." The second officer, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward. His expression was a mix of confusion and unease. "Is this true?" he asked, addressing the first officer. The first officer glared at him. "Stay out of this," he snapped, his frustration boiling over. But the damage was done. The second officer's hesitation, combined with the murmurs of disapproval from the crowd, further eroded the first officer's authority. "Look," the first officer said, his tone shifting to one of forced calm. "Let's just sort this out. There's no need to blow this out of proportion." The teen tilted his head slightly, his calm gaze unrelenting. "Blow this out of proportion?" he repeated. "You punched me in the face. You escalated without cause. And now you're worried about proportions?" The officer opened his mouth to respond, but found he had no words. His confidence, once unshakable, had crumbled under the weight of his own actions. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing moment. The officer's face turned a shade paler, his mind racing as the reality of the situation set in. The teen remained composed, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the officer's growing panic. He didn't gloat or raise his voice. Instead, he stood firm, his quiet strength speaking volumes. When the sirens stopped, several unmarked cars pulled up, and men in suits stepped out. Their presence was commanding, their movements deliberate. One of them approached the teen, his expression one of concern. "Are you okay?" the man asked, his voice steady but kind. "I'm fine," the teen replied, his tone calm. "But we need to address what just happened here." The man nodded, his gaze shifting to the officer, who now stood frozen in place. "Is this the one?" he asked, gesturing toward the officer. "Yes," the teen said simply. The officer's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His arrogance had been replaced by a paralyzing fear, the reality of his actions finally sinking in. "You made a mistake," the man in the suit said, his tone firm but measured, "and there will be consequences." The officer took a shaky step back, his hands trembling. "I didn't know," he began, but the man cut him off. "You didn't need to know," the man said sharply. "Your job is to treat everyone with respect, not to act on your prejudices. You failed, and now you'll be held accountable." The officer looked at the teen, his expression a mix of regret and desperation. "I didn't mean, it's not about what you meant," the teen interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "It's about what you did." The crowd watched in silence as the officer was led away, his authority stripped away along with his confidence. The teen turned to the man in the suit, his expression one of quiet gratitude. "Thank you for coming so quickly," he said. "We'll handle it from here," the man replied. "But I'm proud of how you handled yourself." The teen nodded, his composure unbroken. He had stood his ground, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever faced injustice. As the crowd began to disperse, the teen's calm strength left an indelible mark on everyone who had witnessed the confrontation. The tables had turned, and justice was finally being served. The air was heavy with tension as the officer stood in the middle of the scene, his face pale and his hands trembling. The sound of the approaching officials, their commanding presence, had stripped him of the arrogance he had carried only moments ago. But the most crushing blow came not from their arrival, but from the words of the teen, "He's my uncle." The officer's mind raced as he tried to comprehend what he had just heard. "Your uncle?" he stammered, his voice barely audible. The teen, calm and composed, nodded. "The FBI director. That's who I was speaking to." The crowd, which had been murmuring quietly, erupted into hushed gasps. Witnesses exchanged looks of disbelief, the weight of the revelation settling over them like a heavy fog. Another officer on the scene, who had initially been hesitant to intervene, now stepped forward, his expression shifting from confusion to shock. "Wait a minute," he said, glancing at the first officer. "You just punched the nephew of the FBI director?" The first officer's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His disbelief was matched only by the growing fear in his eyes as the reality of the situation sank in. The teen, however, didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice or display any sense of triumph. Instead, he maintained the same calm demeanor he had shown throughout the encounter. "You didn't need to know who I am to treat me with respect," he said quietly, his words cutting deeper than any raised voice ever could. The man in the suit, who had approached earlier, now turned his attention to the first officer. His tone was sharp but measured. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he asked. "You've not only violated this young man's rights, but you've also jeopardized the integrity of your department." The officer stammered, his words tumbling over each other as he tried to justify his actions. I didn't know. I thought he was—" "You thought he was what?" the teen interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "Someone you could intimidate? Someone you could treat however you wanted because you assumed no one would hold you accountable?" The officer's face flushed, but he had no response. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the murmurs of the crowd. Another witness, a woman who had been recording the incident from the start, stepped forward. "He was calm the entire time," she said, her voice steady. "That officer was the one who escalated. We all saw it." Other onlookers nodded in agreement, their voices joining hers in a chorus of support for the teen. "He didn't do anything wrong," someone else said. "This is exactly why people don't trust the system." The man in the suit raised a hand, quieting the crowd. "This will be handled," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. The officer, now visibly shaking, tried to regain some semblance of control. "Look, I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, his voice cracking. "It was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," the teen repeated, his voice calm but piercing. "You escalated without cause. You assumed I didn't belong here. And when I stood my ground, you used violence to assert your power. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a pattern." The officer's shoulders slumped, his arrogance completely replaced by fear and regret. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice trailing off. "That's the problem," the teen replied. "You didn't know, but you acted anyway. You didn't ask questions. You didn't listen. You just assumed." The man in the suit stepped forward again, his expression stern. "This is going to have consequences," he said to the officer. "Your actions today will not be swept under the rug." The officer's face turned a deeper shade of red as the words sank in. "Please," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean—" "It's not about what you meant," the teen interrupted again. "It's about what you did." The weight of those words hung in the air, echoed by the silence of the crowd. The officer's fear was palpable, his earlier arrogance now a distant memory. The second officer, who had been standing silently nearby, finally spoke. "I should have stepped in sooner," he admitted, his tone filled with guilt. "I saw it happening, and I didn't stop it." The teen looked at him, his expression softening slightly. "It's never too late to do the right thing," he said. "But accountability starts with action." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices a collective acknowledgement of the truth in his words. The man in the suit turned back to the teen. "Your uncle will want a full report on this," he said. "We'll ensure that every detail is documented and justice is served." The teen nodded, his composure never faltering. "Thank you," he said simply. As the scene began to wind down, the officer was led away. His head hung low. The crowd watched in silence, their expressions a mix of relief and reflection. For the teen, the moment wasn't about triumph or revenge. It was about standing up for what was right, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever faced injustice. His connection to the FBI director may have shifted the power dynamic, but his values, fairness, integrity, and accountability were what truly defined him. As the crowd dispersed, many stopped to thank the teen for his composure and courage. "You handled that better than most adults would have," one woman said, her voice filled with admiration. The teen nodded politely, his calm demeanor unwavering. "It's not about winning," he said. "It's about doing what's right." The man in the suit placed a hand on the teen's shoulder. "Your uncle will be proud of how you handled yourself today," he said. The teen smiled faintly, the weight of the moment settling over him. "He always says accountability is the foundation of justice," he replied. "I'm just trying to live by that." The scene ended not with cheers or applause, but with a quiet sense of resolution. Justice hadn't been fully served yet, but the process had begun, and for everyone who had witnessed the encounter, the lesson was clear. Power without accountability is nothing, and respect is a right, not a privilege. The officer's actions didn't go unnoticed. Within hours of the incident, video recordings from bystanders had gone viral, flooding social media and news outlets. Headlines were blunt and unforgiving. "Racist cop punches black teen, faces FBI director's wrath." The footage, showing the officer's aggression and the teen's calm composure, sparked outrage nationwide. The police department responded swiftly, placing the officer on immediate suspension pending an investigation. Public backlash poured in, with citizens demanding answers and accountability. Press conferences were called, and the department's chief issued a statement acknowledging the severity of the incident and vowing transparency. "We hold our officers to the highest standards," he said solemnly. "And when those standards are broken, justice will follow." For the teen, the aftermath wasn't about revenge. It was about setting a precedent. Sitting at home with his uncle, the FBI director, he recounted the day with clarity and poise. "I didn't want to make it about me," he explained. "It's about the bigger picture. How many others have faced this without someone to stand up for them?" His uncle nodded, pride evident in his expression. "You handled yourself with dignity," he said. "But this is bigger than one officer. We need to address the system that allows this behavior to exist unchecked." In the days following the incident, the teen's story became a catalyst for larger conversations. Media outlets interviewed experts and activists, discussing the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of accountability in law enforcement. Community leaders organized town hall meetings, inviting citizens to share their stories and voice their concerns. At one of these meetings, the teen was invited to speak. Standing before a packed room, he addressed the crowd with the same calm composure he had shown during the encounter. "This isn't about one bad officer," he began. "It's about a system that allows prejudice to go unchallenged. We all have a role to play in changing that." His words resonated deeply, sparking applause and a renewed sense of purpose among the attendees. For many, his grace and maturity were a reminder that strength doesn't come from anger. It comes from standing firm in the face of injustice. The officer, now under investigation, faced mounting pressure from both the public and his department. Fellow officers who had once ignored his behavior began to distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with his actions. The weight of his choices pressed heavily on him, and for the first time, he was forced to confront the consequences of his unchecked power. Meanwhile, the teen continued to use his platform to advocate for change. He partnered with his uncle to launch an initiative aimed at improving police training and fostering accountability within law enforcement. The program focused on addressing implicit bias, promoting de-escalation techniques, and creating systems to hold officers accountable for misconduct. The initiative quickly gained traction, drawing support from activists, policymakers, and community members alike. It became a beacon of hope for those who had long felt voiceless in the face of systemic injustice. As the weeks turned into months, the teen's story remained a powerful reminder of the importance of respect and accountability. Media outlets followed the progress of the initiative, highlighting the positive impact it was having on communities across the country. One day, during an interview with a prominent journalist, the teen was asked what he hoped people would take away from his story. He paused for a moment before responding. "I hope they understand that respect shouldn't be conditional," he said. "We all deserve to be treated with dignity, no matter who we are or where we come from. And when that doesn't happen, we need to hold those in power accountable, not out of revenge, but to ensure it doesn't happen again." The journalist nodded, visibly moved by his words. "You've inspired so many people," she said. "What keeps you so grounded?" The teen smiled faintly. "My family," he replied. "They taught me that strength comes from standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. And that's what I try to live by every day." The officer's disciplinary hearing ended with his termination, a decision that sent a clear message about the department's commitment to accountability. For the community, it was a small but significant step toward rebuilding trust. The teen's uncle, reflecting on the incident, expressed pride in how his nephew had handled himself. "He turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change," he said. "That's what leadership looks like." The teen, however, remained humble. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about creating a world where no one has to go through this again." As the story began to fade from the headlines, its impact remained. Conversations about accountability and respect continued to grow, spurred by the teen's unwavering commitment to justice. His actions had sparked a ripple effect, inspiring others to stand up for what was right and demand better from those in power. In the end, the lesson was clear. Authority comes with responsibility, and power without accountability leads to injustice. But through respect, humility, and a commitment to change, true justice could be achieved. The teen's story wasn't just a tale of resilience. It was a call to action, a reminder that standing up for what's right has the power to inspire change far beyond the moment. This story teaches us a powerful lesson. Authority without accountability leads to injustice. True power comes from respect, fairness, and humility. The teen's grace and composure showed the world that even in the face of prejudice, standing firm in your values can spark meaningful change. What about you? Have you ever witnessed someone abusing their authority? How did it make you feel, and what would you have done in that situation? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experiences in the comments below. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more impactful tales that challenge injustice and inspire action. Together, we can amplify stories that promote respect, fairness, and accountability. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Stay tuned for the next story, where we'll uncover another truth that challenges perspectives and inspires change. See you soon, and remember, change starts with all of us.